Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 13th of November 2024, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Mike Robinson. Joining me today, we have Vanessa Beeley from Damascus, as usual, and Charles Malet, who's still in Hong Kong. Welcome to the programme, both. And Charles, we're going to get started off with farming and be talking about the upcoming, can we call them protests next week? But what have you got?
Thanks, Mike. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, all. Yes, indeed, farming and the recurring themes of funding and food security. But we'll start with a clip from GB News recently, which has been doing the rounds on social media. Patrick Christys interviewing somebody called John McTernan, and we'll hear what he says that has caused quite so much outrage.
Well, personally, in favour of doing to farmers want to go on the streets, we can do to them what Margaret Thatcher did to the miners.
So just to be clear, John, you would, beat them up?
No, close them. This is an industry we could do without.
So, okay, all right, so this got weird. So you would do to farmers what Margaret Thatcher did to miners, which was, she used very heavy-handed police tactics, followed by what? Putting them out of business?
If people are so upset that they want to go on the streets and spray slurry on them, then we don't need the small farmers.
Now, before we examine what it is that he said, let's just look at who John McTernan is. And the Institute for Government page here describes him as a senior fellow with extensive experience in government, advising prime ministers around the world. He was Tony Blair's Director of Political Operations. Now, that should give people a clue as to why he said what he did say. And of course, I think the point to be made here is that within the context that he speaks, he is absolutely right. On screen now is a diagram showing all the major players in the food industry in the United Kingdom. And the only reason that they are able to do what they do is because we continue to buy this stuff. So people who are up in arms or opposing the globalist agenda need to consider this aspect of it, probably in slightly more detail, before the comments of people like John McTernan can be rejected. Of course, the point he makes is that small farms are indeed entirely dispensable because there are bigger players there who will conform to the model that suits not just their industry, but also the government that is deciding whether or not to work with them. And for people still to be labouring under the misapprehension that the government is there to support small farms, I think need to think again. Now, just by way of a case study, we'll just look at Cargill, one of the big players, actually worldwide, but really an American food business. And I've highlighted the word successful there. They make no mention of the fact that it would be beneficial if the food that was produced was healthy for people, but also for the environment. And just to sort of reinforce that point, the ingredients that they provide, the other food producers, they talk about proteins based on wheat and corn, so not actually wheat and corn, and therefore not actually food. As to the type of player that we're dealing with, we go to worldgrain.com, who report in 2023 that they were turning over $177 billion, which is almost equivalent to the budget, the entire year's worth of budget for the National Health Service. That went down for the current fiscal year to about 160 billion. But the point here, or at least the question to ask, is why on earth, given those statistics, would government be paying attention to small farmers rather than these big industry players with their absolutely enormous lobbying capability? So to consider this in light of what's happened on the other side of the Atlantic, there's been much speculation about whether or not there's going to be any kind of pushback against these big corporate players. And we look at the words of Congressman Thomas Massie, who has been touted as perhaps the Secretary of State for Agriculture in the United States. He sent out a tweet in which he says, "I stand ready and willing to help the president with any part of his bold agenda to focus on the health and well-being of Americans, but I have received no commitments or offers from President Trump's team, and any discussion of the transition are premature." Now, the reason I pulled Thomas Massie into this is because he has been going to something called the Road Food Conference for many years. He's tweeted about it here. And he says, today I'm coming out of the pantry. I'll be at Joel Salatin's farm in Swoop, Virginia on May 17th and 18th. That was this year. And Joel Salatin, to those of you who follow the UK column interviews, is somebody that I spoke to a couple of months ago here with an interview called Let the Animals Do the Work. And Salatin's philosophy is one in which effectively the sort of the four tenets are all addressed with the same model, in that farming can work well for the business, or at least farming can work as a profitable business. It can work for the community, and it can provide healthy and nutritious food for the consumer, but also benefit the environment. And this is not something that governments typically are choosing to embrace, despite the protestations that they are going down the regenerative agriculture route. Now, all of these will be in the show notes, but in addition to the Salatin interview, there is a range of others from the UK column stable, which indicate exactly how well this can be done. We've got John Cook here talking about his raw milk business, dealing directly with the consumer. Angus McIntosh in South Africa doing effectively the same thing whilst regenerating the landscape, as well as Sir Julian Rose, who effectively pioneered many years ago the early organic movement, whilst it was still being done effectively in a sort of legitimate sense. And then more recently, Mark Byford, a Suffolk farmer who, again, deals directly with the consumer and arranges his business so that he has a direct relationship with the community. But of course, this is not what John McTernan is talking about, and it speaks volumes that he was quite so closely involved with Tony Blair then, and indeed the philosophy not just of Blair, but all those who have been within his orbit over these years. Now, as Mike referenced at the beginning, there have been rumblings in the United Kingdom across the farming community over the course of 2024, which of course has been a very difficult year for farmers, not just because of the weather, but also because of the changing nature of the environmental land management schemes that the government has started and then changed and left a great deal of uncertainty. As Julian Rose says, subsidy creates slaves. Nonetheless, there are a couple of events planned for next Tuesday, the 19th of November in London. So we'll just have a quick look at what those are and hope to resolve some of the confusion that may have arisen. We've got the National Farmers Union describing what is called a mass lobby event, which requires prior contact with your MP if you are a farmer or a grower. And this has been orchestrated by the NFU to meet with their MPs in Parliament, and as they say here, urging them to ask the Chancellor to reconsider the changes to inheritance tax. Of course, I spoke about this last week, the changes to the agricultural property relief. And a point worth making here is that the business property relief was rather sort of left out because there was so much focus on farmers. But of course, this does affect people who run businesses as well. And with so little time to prepare, of course, it is possible to mitigate against this with the 7-year rule. But because this is due to take effect in 2026, there is in effect a point beyond which farmers are left powerless to avoid or at least not incur a tax that was previously not there in their path. So as I say, there's a mass lobby in London on Tuesday the 19th. As well as that, there's due to be a rally. Now, the organisers of each event insist that there's to be effectively sort of cooperation between the two, and that if you are going to the mass lobby event, you can also turn up to the rally. You do need to register to do that, and this seems to be because the Metropolitan Police have either given the organisers the impression, or the organisers have effectively deduced that there are anti-terror considerations here that they need to address. So those are the two events that you can consider going to and supporting. But ultimately, I think the message here is really one of trust. And why on earth should small farmers trust the government? What is it that they really do expect the government to do, given their track record?
Yes. Yeah. Thank you, Charles, for that. Thank you very much. We'll talk much more about that in extra. Now, let's come on to military affairs and defence and so on. But I want to put this on screen, first of all, because, of course, the UK column has been talking about European Defence Union for a number of years. And as we'll see in a minute, the election of Donald Trump has reinvigorated this whole discussion. Now, it's a topic which hasn't really managed to gain engagement widely. And certainly people within our audience have been interested in it, but it hasn't got much wider engagement because one of the reasons is it has got absolutely zero coverage in the mainstream press. But it should motivate us because, as we can see here on screen, Britain is 100% or has been up to this point 100% engaged with it, even in 2017 or so, wearing the EU flag on their arms. No Union flags as far as I can see on the uniforms here. The question is, why would this be something that we need to be worried about? Well, if we consider who would be in charge of an EU military and ask ourselves the question, do we want this woman to be holding the keys to French nuclear deterrence, for example? Because that's really what we're looking at here. And as I say, the British government 100% behind this, as we will see in a minute. Now, over the years, with the full complicity of NATO, there has been an effort to drive forward this European Defence Union project. It has not gained a huge amount of traction because there's lots of friction against this, because, of course, national governments, member states, even member states that are of a supranational organisation like the EU, are reluctant to cede control over their own militaries. That wasn't until Trump came along, and this was 2017 when Trump was president and was opening the new NATO headquarters in Brussels. And there he is with Jens Stoltenberg standing beside a large chunk of the World Trade Center. Now, as I say, Britain was and still is 100% supportive of this initiative, and as because of Trump's sort of aggressive attitude towards the Europeans with respect to the funding of NATO and funding of defence in Europe in 2017, RUSI and a bunch of other think tanks, defence think tanks, pushed forward to try to gain some momentum on this European defence thing here. So this was March 2019. Jeremy Wimble from RUSI saying in March 2019, RUSI and the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung brought together leading UK and German parliamentarians and leading security and defence experts. The subject of a European army dominated most of the discussion. With the goal of achieving strategic autonomy for Europe, European states should seek to form a joint command structure that would allow the EU to deploy forces both within and beyond Europe's borders. It was strongly suggested that the US can no longer be regarded as a reliable partner and that Europe ought to take responsibility for its own defence mechanisms. And of course, once Biden became president, legitimately or not, a lot of the momentum fell out of this. That has changed again. But just to keep on the thread here, also in 2019, the European Council of the European Union published this document from the European External Action Service, the European Foreign Service, effectively, and the subject was EU concept for military command and control. This is the document, and this is basically a couple of excerpts from it. So the EU-led military operational chain of command is based on vertical top-to-bottom responsibility. So we should not forget that Ursula von der Leyen, being at the top, would be in charge of this. This implies that each level of command is responsible for establishing the necessary links to the immediate subordinate level. A single identifiable and clear military chain of command is imperative. The exact command and control arrangements for any EU-led military CSDP, that is the defence policy in the EU, operations and missions are mission dependent. The chain of command for EU-led military CSDP operations and missions will encompass 3 levels of command below the political strategic level. So we should not ignore the fact that the political strategic level is at the top. Now, when Ursula was attempting to get her role as president of the European Commission for the first term, she made this statement.
Now, I'm going to jump right forward now to the present day. And I'd like to talk about 4 different components which we introduced back then which I believe are the important structural elements for setting up a European Defence Union. First of all, just 2-3 weeks ago, we were able to for the first time, we were able to give the red light for a European command capacity in Brussels. That's the first time that civil and military instruments would actually be commanded together, and where these commands would actually come from one single central command office. That's an essential step forward. It was unthinkable a short while ago, but it's precisely the right approach to have if we want a European flavour to our defence policy.
So we need to ask ourselves again, do we really want this lady in charge of European defence and Britain involved in that, as you'll see in 1 second? Now, Trump has been elected, the momentum is back, and Andreas Kubilius has been made the new EU Commissioner for Defence and Space. So effectively, the EU all of a sudden now has a defence, what they call a defence department, a defence secretary, effectively. And now he is the former head of, or former Prime Minister of Lithuania. He served as that from 1999 to 2000, and then from 2008 to 2012. He's described as a political heavyweight. His political background is described as being shaped by global crises and by the presence on the border of a hostile Russia. So we see exactly what he represents and so on. But as I say, Britain 100% behind this. Starmer headed over to Paris for the Remembrance Day, or the day after Remembrance Day, for more commemorations. And this was absolutely part of the discussions there. It was very interesting that the British readout on this didn't mention defence. I've just put that back on screen for a second, because, but the French readout on this did. So the French said that during the meeting, the two leaders discussed the major international issues. Following on from the messages conveyed at the European Political Community Summit in Hungary, President Macron stressed the need to assert Europeans' own interests and capabilities in terms of security and defence. This wasn't in the UK readout. So again, we're back in this situation. As far as the UK is concerned, they don't want to mention this publicly, and they don't want to, certainly isn't going to get any major UK media coverage. Now, having said that, it has had some. And so the Telegraph here starting to make noises in promotion of this idea. The hard choices on defence lie before us. And then they were also saying that Macron and Scholz call for EU to unite on defence after Trump victory. But it doesn't end there, because actually, I can't remember whether we covered this on the UK column or not, but Rusi back in July asking what can the new government's proposed UK-EU security pact achieve. And for example, just to take one quote from this article, they say Foreign Secretary David Lammy has designated the EU as his number one foreign policy priority, including structured foreign policy dialogues that could lead to an ambitious UK-EU security pact. And when they talk about security, they also include defence. So, Charles, I'd be interested in your thoughts on this, because particularly the wearing of EU badges on British military uniforms. I appreciate that was the year before the Brexit referendum, but nonetheless, the UK has been 100% behind this common security and defence policy from the beginning, and continues to be. And now they want a pact, a security and defence pact with the EU. And what we've got to keep in mind, of course, if we consider NATO as being whatever number of countries it is at the moment, that NATO would effectively become the United States, Canada, Britain, the EU, and all those other member states effectively disappear from NATO under those circumstances.
Well, that's really what I was sort of considering, is that the layers, I mean, we've talked about the layers of bureaucracy, or what they're calling command and control, sort of hierarchical structure. But really, I think one of the questions is, well, what does happen to NATO, specifically with regard to the United Kingdom? And as you say, that was some time ago. But yes, the wearing of the EU flag does seem extraordinarily strange. But then, of course, I suppose we consider something that I was reporting on a little while ago, which was the rules of engagement and the doctrine surrounding that Joint Services publication 398, which of course is very clear to describe the rules of engagement as, in effect, being the translation of the political will. So to see, as much as we might not like it, Ursula von der Leyen speaking as she is, in effect, it's no different from what we see at the national level. I think the huge amount of confusion, though, is to suggest that under the same structure, or at least side by side, a civil military arrangement could be made sort of seamlessly, and that there would be, as far as she seems to describe it, no one lead, that there would be balance or parity between the civil and the military, which seems extraordinarily complicated and very hard to practice, but ultimately something that I think the United Kingdom should stay well out of. But of course, that doesn't seem to be the direction that we're heading in.
Indeed. We will talk more about this later as well. Vanessa, let me welcome you to the programme. And of course, questions over who Donald Trump is going to choose in his administration and what effect that is going to have on Middle East policy.
Yeah, not so many questions. If we look at the names that are being touted through mainstream media in the US, of course, those may change. I'm not saying they're written in stone, but it is looking very much as if he's heading towards a Zionist-heavy and Christian Zionist-heavy administration. Now, since Trump's election, Israel has grown in its boldness in conducting genocide in Gaza. Bezalel Smotrich, who's the finance minister, tells authorities to prepare for the West Bank annexation, saying that now that Trump is elected, they feel that they can go forward this. The intensity of bombing in Lebanon has increased exponentially since Trump's election. So it's very clear that the Zionists feel emboldened by his election. So I want to focus a little bit on Syria. And this was an interview with Robert Kennedy Jr. not so long ago with Tucker Carlson. And I just want to focus, he said, Trump and his policy. So let's.
For them. When I was on the plane the other day with President Trump, we were talking about the Mideast, and he took a piece of paper and he drew on it a map of the Mideast with all the nations on it, which most Americans couldn't do.
No.
And then he wrote in each country the troop strength. And he was particularly looking at the border between Syria and Turkey, and he said, we have 500 men on the border of Syria and Turkey, and a little, encampment that was bombed. And he said, there's 750,000 troops in Turkey. There's 250,000 in Syria. If they go up against each other, we're in the middle. And he said to his generals, well, what's going to happen to those 500 men? And his general said to him, they're going to be cannon fodder. And he said, get them out. So we want a president who has that knowledge. He's going to ask those rational questions and then is going to make good decisions for the American public.
Now, there are 28 US military bases in the Northeast, so Kennedy was slightly downplaying that. 900 US military forces, but a number of private contractors. In fact, more than 1,000 private contractors like DynCorp. So this is Kevin Gosztola on X, a journalist who came up with Trump will reportedly name Senator Marco Rubio as his Secretary of State. On Tucker Carlson's show, J.D. Vance said Trump won't hire neocons that refuse to withdraw US troops from Syria. But Rubio obviously or absolutely opposed Trump's withdrawal plan and is a neocon war hawk like Liz Cheney. And he goes on in the thread that he put on X. So if we just move to the next slide. So he talks about Waltz, who also opposed Trump's plan to withdraw US troops from Syria, calling the plan a Pandora's box for the return of ISIS. ISIS, of course, is a US proxy in Syria. And Waltz co-sponsored legislation with none other than fellow war hawk Liz Cheney to help continue the US military's role in Syria in defiance of Trump. And reportedly, Trump plans to name Republican Mike Waltz as his national security advisor. He's a neocon warhawk who was part of Foundation for Defense of Democracy's John Bolton's think tank. And then, so how I'm looking at how this is playing out at the moment, I believe, if we go on to the next slide, we're looking at basically the Trump administration offering a carrot to President Assad, saying, if you behave, we might withdraw our troops from inside Syria. And at the same time, Israel is producing the stick. So I mentioned 2 weeks ago, Minister Gideon Saar, the message that Israel should convey to the Assad regime in Syria, that he should drop Iran and Hezbollah. And more recently, in a report that was picked up by a number of local media, in this case, if we just move on to the Islamic Republic news agency, Zionist regime threatens to assassinate Assad. So what were they actually talking about? According to Palestinian media, Israel Hayom newspaper quoted regime officials as saying that Assad was informed that if he did not cooperate with Israel in preventing the transfer of weapons from Syria to Lebanon, he will suffer the same fate of Syed Hassan Nasrallah. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, while at the UN in New York, had ordered the assassination of Nasrallah, who was martyred in an Israeli airstrike on Beirut. And Avigdor Lieberman also issued a similar warning to President Assad, all of them pushing him to drop Iran and Hezbollah. And of course, as I said, Trump now coming in with potentially the carrot to say, if you do this, you comply, we might withdraw our troops from inside Syria. And then various other titles in media, Israel's squeeze on Hezbollah puts pressure on Syria's Assad to pivot away from Iran. This was after Nasrallah's assassination. Israeli media has been pushing the line that there is division between President Assad and his brother Maher al-Assad, Iran's man in Damascus. And there was actually a drone strike on what was considered to be a villa very much connected to Maher al-Assad back in late September. And of course, we have to remember that while he initially denied that he wanted to have Trump killed, I think it was in 2019 in an interview, he admitted that he had wanted to assassinate Assad. So this is Trump making that admission to Fox News.
You take to get Soleimani, and is it true that after Assad gassed children for the second time, that it was you that wanted to take out Assad, that you had a good sight on him, and that it was General Mattis who talked you out of it? And if it is true, do you regret not taking him out, being that he's not, because he is a mass murderer?
I would have rather taken him out. I had it all set. Mattis didn't want to do it. Mattis was a highly overrated general, and I let him go. He worked for Obama. He got fired by Obama.
And in addition, of course, the US has been building its Air Force capability in Qatar, in Bahrain for some time. And most recently, in addition to deploying dozens of fighter jets from various types and 6 B-52 strategic bombers in the Middle East region, the US Air Force has deployed F-15E Strike Eagles from the 492nd Fighter Squadron RAF Lakenheath in England in the Middle East. So are we seeing the UK getting involved, as we've been talking about? And then, of course, so you have the carrot and the stick, putting pressure on President Assad to do as he's told. Then the chief of staff of the Saudi armed forces has been in Iran for talks with officials. Saudi Arabia is often used as a kind of negotiating instrument by Israel and the US. What is President Assad's response to all of this? I mean, absolutely what his response was when they were trying to court him prior to the regime change war that began in 2011. He appeared at the special extraordinary summit of the Arab League to discuss the situation in Palestine. So what he says is what we need is decision to use the tools we possess to stop the Zionist massacres. And I'm just going to play a section of his speech.
لن أتحدث عن حقوق الفلسطينيين التاريخية الثابتة وحتمية التمسك بها، أو عن صمود الشعبين اللبناني والفلسطيني وواجبنا في دعمهما العاجل والفوري، ولا عن شرعية المقاومة في كلا البلدين وما جسدته من شرف وكرامة ورقي وما قدمته من أيقونات بقادتها الشرفاء ومقاتليها الشجعان. لن أتحدث عن نازية المحتلين الصهاينة وجرائمهم وكيانهم المصطنع، ولا عن تحول الغرب من داعم لهذا الكيان وجرائمه منذ قيامه إلى شريك مباشر ومعلن فيها، فهذا لن يضيف شيئا لما يعرفه غالبية العرب والمسلمين وما يعرفه كثيرون غيرهم في العالم اليوم. أما عن قمتنا فمنذ عام مضى التقينا وعبرنا، أدنا واستنكرنا، ومنذ عام والجريمة مستمرة، فهل نلتقي اليوم لكي نستنسخ الماضي الراحل وأحداثه أم لنبدل في مسار المستقبل القادم؟
So effectively, that was the beginning of the very strong message from President Assad, not only to the Arab League summit, where he berated them for literally having done nothing for 1 year, but he then continued without any direct action. We encourage the continuation of the genocide and become indirect partners in it, as we are not dealing with a state in the legal sense, but rather with an outlaw colonial entity. We are not dealing with people in the civilized sense, but rather with herds of settlers who are closer to barbarism than to humanity. He added that it is not correct to say that the problem is the current mindless extremist government and a people terrified of what happened on October the 7th of last year. They are all working with one ideological mind, a mind sick with bloodshed, sick with the illusion of superiority, afflicted with schizophrenia between hating Nazism allegedly and loving it as an organic part of themselves, is what he meant. So an incredibly powerful message from President Assad, as I said, not only in response to what is happening in Palestine and Lebanon, in support of the people of those two countries, but also a message to Israel that has been threatening his life, to the US that is trying to encourage him or incentivize him to comply with their agenda. Quite extraordinary times in Syria right now.
Thank you, Vanessa. Just want to clarify one thing, and that is that RAF Lakenheath, although it does have the RAF on the front, is effectively a US military base in the United Kingdom. So this is where we are going to be seeing US nuclear weapons back on UK soil in the not too distant future as part of the F-35 deployment there. But that is. Sorry, we will continue to report on that. Now, if you like what the UK column does, if you'd like to support us, we do need your support. Please go to support.ukcolumn.org. You can help us out in various ways there. You can make a donation. You could join as a member, and there are various membership levels. You could support us by picking up something at the UK Column shop, and that helps greatly. And also, if you buy something from clive2carl.com using the link on that page, you will it won't cost you any more to do that, but we'll get a small percentage of any purchases that you make. Now, also, as we'll see a little later in the program, censorship continues, and we do need you to help with that. So please share any of the material you find on the UK Column website. And if you are a member, you can have a look at the comments and make comments by clicking on that link there. Now, a little bit of news for you. US Congress is holding another UFO hearing this week. In fact, it's happening today. So this, since I took the screenshot, has been updated. That congressional hearing will be happening today. And just by coincidence, tomorrow at 1 p.m., I will be speaking to Matt Errett on the issue of the UFO agenda, how that's being used to drive global governance, the people that are behind it. He has been producing a fantastic documentary series on that. He is now at episode 3, and he's starting to look at MK Ultra, CIA, and the types of people that have been pushing the agenda through those programs. Let's just listen to a couple of minutes of it.
So L. Ron Hubbard was in charge of the California Ordo Templi Orientis that Crowley led. And L. Ron Hubbard created a school of thought, of a religion called Scientology, a UFO cult. And his students became very close to Jacques Vallée within the Stanford Research Institute. They are the ones who also were very much working with the CIA, Ingo Swann and others. trying to utilize MK Ultra techniques, as you alluded to, psilocybin, DMT, other forms of LSD research that were all developed by the military-industrial complex and British intelligence. They were all developed by these institutions, and then they were using them to create different forms of de-patterning, psychological trauma to help people tap into controlled schizophrenia that was believed to give people access to higher paranormal powers of telepathy, astral plane projection, pretty much everything. And that's what they were doing under Jacques Vallée's lead with this team at SRI in the 70s under what became the Stargate Project. This fed directly into the Changing Images of Man operation with Willis Hartman. And Willis Hartman, by the way, his assistant was the woman who wrote The Aquarian Conspiracy, which was a direct take from H.G. Wells' earlier Open Conspiracy directly. So this is what was all done to try to change the idea of what human beings thought we were, utilizing a variety of techniques of hypnosis, matters of Jungian and Freudian psychology, Weberian sociology, a little mix of all of these things, to then bring about a new age of sorcerers with a highly superstitious population that would perhaps believe that the religions that they thought they were a part of were actually the constructs of UFOs or aliens from either other galaxies or maybe even other dimensions.
So if you'd like to see a bit more of that, 1 p.m. tomorrow in the usual places, I do encourage you to watch this extremely interesting conversation. Yesterday, Brian was speaking to Justin Walker on the Treasury letter. If you want to know a bit more about that, it's on the UK Column website at the moment. And just another reminder that the ongoing petition in Wales, Ensure Diagnosis and Treatment for People Suffering from Adverse COVID-19 Vaccine Side Effects. We absolutely encourage everybody to support this. It needs 10,000 signatures to get a debate. I appreciate that nobody is going to particularly value petitions as such, because petitioning the government is never productive. But this is a perfect organizing tool, a perfect way of getting a message out. So please help. And of course, whenever this does get to be debated in the Welsh Parliament and nothing gets done about it, that's another opportunity to promote what's been going on around it. So it is worthwhile doing this, whether or not you agree with the idea of petitions. Charles, let's come back to you. And what's been going on in Hong Kong?
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, we'll wind the clock back a little bit to May of this year, to a story that captured much of the public attention in Hong Kong, but far less so in the United Kingdom. And I think it might be time to have another look at it. And it concerns the allegation, at least, of spying in the United Kingdom on people who had moved away from Hong Kong, ostensibly in response to legislation passed by the Chinese administration in 2020, which meant that people could be pursued for all sorts of crimes. And in this particular instance, a lady called Monica Kwong, who was being effectively chased on claims of fraud or allegations of fraud. And in the United Kingdom, out of the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Office, a 3-man team apparently was run to surveil her, one of whom was Matthew Trickett, who, after having been arrested and released on court bail by the Metropolitan Police, was found dead a few days later in a park in Maidenhead. As far as I'm aware, the cause of his death has not been released by Thames Valley Police. But nonetheless, what this brings out is a couple of things. First of all, from the Migration Observatory, very important in light of what's going on in the United Kingdom. It's just a reminder, really, that in 2021, the rules were changed by the British government for British nationals overseas, which has paved the way for potentially up to 5.4 million people from Hong Kong being able to assume nationality in the United Kingdom and therefore move into the UK. And the other thing that we are able to look at, which is what these men were arrested under, is the National Security Act 2023, which has received remarkably little coverage given its provisions. There's certainly not time to go into a huge amount of detail today, given the time. But nonetheless, the Foreign Influence Registration Scheme, FIRS, is one of the things that is worth looking at. That on the government's website, they ask, how does it compare to the National Security and Investment Act 2021? And effectively, this is the British government sort of trying to cover all bases, where the 2021 Act gives the government powers to scrutinise and intervene in business transactions, apparently to protect national security, whereas FIRS, the registration scheme, requires the registration of particular activities or arrangement in order to strengthen the integrity of UK politics and institutions and protect the country from state threats. Yes, I did just say the integrity of UK politics. And they go on to clarify, and this is the bit where it becomes sort of murkier, that, of course, there can be situations in which arrangements with foreign powers to carry out political influence activities, in that some of this may be deemed legitimate, but of course it's for the government and or the police to decide what is legitimate, what is not, and who may fall foul of such legislation. But they go on to say activities by specified entities in the UK or arrangements with specified foreign powers or entities to carry out activities in the UK. And this effectively suggests that the remit of this legislation is terrifically broad. Of course, it talks about terrorism as well, and indeed the special powers that are granted by those that would be dealing with such legislation. So I think this is worth considering. But the other reason for looking at it is that in the government's note, they ask, will it affect freedom of expression? And they say that it will have no impact on people's right to express their views, nor will it prevent anyone from engaging in political influence activities. Now, this seems remarkably unlikely. It simply requires openness and transparency around such activities where undertaken at the direction of a foreign power. Now, if you do have time to go into at least the government documents explaining what the Act does, then I would recommend it, because it is beyond doubt a tool that may be used for the purposes of censorship. And this is therefore the moment to highlight the campaign being run by UK Column at the moment. We had a news special on this a couple of weeks ago, taking the fight to the censors, also involving Wilsey of Resistance GB. So I would encourage you to listen to that, but also to look at the Fight Against Censorship campaign. And if this is relevant to you and you fulfill the criteria of Section 56 of the Online Safety Act, in that you can be recognised as a recognised news publisher, please get in touch at onlinesafety@ukcolumn.org.
Charles, thank you. And of course, we should mention that at the moment, YouTube has taken the UK Columns YouTube channel back down again. We will keep you updated on how that goes. Yeah, more later, more in extra perhaps. Vanessa, let me bring you back on. And you've just paid a visit to Beirut. So you're talking about the bombing of Beirut increasing. What did you see when you were there?
Well, first of all, people can go to my Substack to read the full report. But basically, if we just have a look at the map where I just showed how before the blue dotted line at the bottom there from Damascus to Beirut is the old route through the border that Israel has now bombed several times, reducing much of the road to craters and rubble, although I've heard that the Syrians are now using golf carts to bring people from one side to the other in defiance of Israel's closure of the road. So now basically I had to go north from Damascus up to Homs, then to Tartus on the eastern coast, and where you can see the no entry sign is where Israel has bombed the old western route from Homs to the border. So in other words, you have to go further north and further west to come south. Following the Tripoli kind of Batroun coastal road down to Beirut. I'll just show, this is just a video showing the coastal route once you enter Lebanon from the Syrian side. Really a pretty route and not particularly busy. It was busier on the way back, I guess, with food trucks and humanitarian aid trucks and refugee cars coming into Syria. 300,000 children have entered Syria since Israel, from Lebanon, since Israel started bombing. And basically, I didn't have much time because I was told I should get back to Syria as soon as possible in case Israel bombed again. But I did manage to go to Dakhil with some friends who were going to check out their house. So this was just a couple of the videos that I managed to take of the devastation. My friend actually said to me, the apartment block that was shown there was 10-story. They were horrified by the number of kind of familiar landmarks that they had grown up with that had been destroyed or heavily damaged. We saw from a distance the crater that had where Syed Nasrallah had been assassinated. It was vast and incredibly deep. And of course, when we entered this area, there was a Lebanon army checkpoint who told us that we shouldn't get out of the car, we should wear masks, and we shouldn't open the windows because of the possible risk of depleted uranium dust from many of the strikes in this area. And actually, speaking to locals, they did tell me that initially, after Nasrallah's assassination, they had suffered with the ill effects of the dust, so nausea, diarrhea, and bad stomachs. They drank milk, and after a few days, the effects went away. But the smell is pretty horrible. And literally, I think the day after I left, this was just one of the bombing raids by the Israelis on that area. We can watch that.
يا زهراء يا زهراء يا زهراء يا أبا عبد الله الحسين يا زهراء يا أبا عبد الله.
Somebody asked me what the guy was saying, and he's basically just saying, oh God, I'm not sure what Zahra is. But even on my way back, there were 3 attacks on on Syria, one in Homs, one in southern Damascus, and one on Aleppo. So even in those 3 days that I was away, the attacks against Syria by Israel continued.
Vanessa, thank you very much for that. Yes, we will obviously continue reporting as events progress. Now let's come back to the UK. Now Politico a while ago had this article. Tony Blair admits UK will need a little persuading to embrace digital ID. So the question is then, what kind of persuading do we need? Will we get an idea of what kind of persuading this particular regime is going to continue to impose? With this, you give your service, says the graphic, with digital veteran cards. You will get the government service you need quicker. So the veteran card is something that Charles has covered a couple of times. And in fact, we believe the last time he covered this, he predicted or suggested that this was on its way. It has now happened, and they decided to announce this on Remembrance Day. So the veteran card, they claim, is currently used by 250,000 former service personnel across the country. And a new digital version will make sure people can prove their veteran status as easily as possible. Convenience is always important. The digital veteran card planned to come in next year will speed up this process and mean they're able to access the support available to them more quickly. Harnessing the power of technology, it will be crucial to support the government in achieving its mission of making public services work for all working people, grow the economy, and make everyone across the country better off. Specifically, the digital veteran card will help former forces personnel approach a military charity to quickly prove their veteran status and speed up access to support they need. This includes housing support through Operation Fortitude, health services through the NHS, or employment through job centres. It will also help veterans confirm their service to the Going Forward into Employment scheme, which helps them join the civil service, NHS, or work in justice. Additionally, veterans can use the card to apply for the Defence Discount Card, offering hundreds of retail offers, and their Veteran Rail Card, getting a third off rail travel from most journeys. So this is what Peter Kyle, the Science Secretary, had to say. Our veterans have sacrificed so much for this country, and we must make every effort to ensure veterans get the help and support they're entitled to. That's why we're working with the Office for Veterans Affairs to speed up access to essential services, whether it's housing or employment support, by offering our heroes digital veterans cards which will be with them in a matter of minutes. So that is great, isn't it? In the meantime, the government has continuing to roll out the one login system, which means that you can easily identify yourself to all kinds of government services. So faster, easier access, more convenience to 50 government services with one login. And in this case, it's the apprenticeship service, which is now fully transitioned into one platform and one login, simplifying the way employers, apprentices, and training providers interact with the government, making process more efficient and removing the need for numerous logins. So that's good stuff. So the question is, how has this been covered in the press? Well, not much in the mainstream press, but sort of the House here saying with digital ID we can take back control. The time has come for government to fully embrace digital ID, to reform public services, empower the citizen and fuel economic growth. And then here we have biometricupdate.com saying UK data and digital ID bill lauded ahead of parliamentary debate. And of course, this, I think, is the key area of focus. We've got all this push towards digital identity. It's all being enabled by this piece of legislation, which, if we have to remember, is just a rehash of what the Tories were attempting to do just a few months ago, but couldn't get it through before the general election. But the new name for it is the Digital Use and Access Bill. Now, we've mentioned many times that when it comes to digital ID, we're talking about having a digital wallet, and inside that wallet you will have various attributes. It might be your name, it might be your date of birth, it might be your employment status, it might be your right to work in this country, and a whole host of other information held in your digital wallet. And of course, third-party companies will be there to provide this service, to act as a trusted source of authority for your identity anytime you interact with government or with anybody else. But if we just put that back on screen for a second, we just need to look at a couple of the attributes of this bill. So creates a framework for digital ID that we've just spoken about that. But the other one that I want to really focus on here is the enabling easier data sharing. And I want to illustrate this just by looking at this article from The Atlantic, which is entitled "Genetic Discrimination is Coming for Us All. Insurers," this is health insurers in the United States, "are refusing to cover Americans whose DNA reveals health risks. It's perfectly legal." And of course, this type of situation is coming to the UK. It doesn't matter that we've got a national health service. It won't make any difference. This is coming to the UK. Now, just looking at a couple of the quotes from this, for decades, they say researchers have feared that people might be targeted over their DNA, but they weren't sure how often it was happening. Now, at least a handful of Americans are experiencing what they argue is a form of discrimination. It goes on to say that even employers might soon be able to hire or fire based on certain genetic risk factors. All of us have glitches somewhere in our genome, the article says. The question is, who will take advantage of that information? And of course, what they're talking about here in this case is health information and health insurance in the United States. Now, insurance companies traditionally provide insurance on the basis that the risk is shared amongst all the people that buy a particular insurance policy. So some people will be high risk, people will be very low risk, and they do a risk assessment of that, and they set the premiums for people based on an average. Perhaps there's some scope for change in that depending on perceived risk and so on, but nonetheless, it's not very specific. But this piece of legislation makes it very specific because it allows for exactly this type of thing: the sharing of genetic information, the sharing of all kinds of data, and the sharing of data across borders. So I'm going to say to everybody that if you're not actively involved in campaigning against this piece of legislation, you need to be actively involved. You might like to start with the hashtag ScrapTheApp and getting involved in Debbie's efforts to get people to not install the NHS app and other apps, and if you are using it, to get rid of it and to demand other ways to access services instead of this continual drive for digitization. But this piece of legislation needs to be stopped, and really everybody, I feel, should be getting involved in that very, very quickly. Charles, let me welcome you back and talk about COP16 and climate issues.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, and actually, this segment will follow yours rather more closely than people might imagine. This refers to not COP29, but COP16, which is somewhat confusing. But this is Conference of the Parties, specifically with regard to biodiversity. And interestingly, coming from the literature, there's very little reference to climate, which suggests perhaps that it has been overused to an extent, and that a more traditional approach concerning species decline may be on the horizon. Nonetheless, they say that attendees at the summit in Cali in Colombia, which included Steve Reed, the Environment Secretary, Nature Minister Mary Creer, and Natural England Chair Tony Juniper, agreed a deal on digital sequence information, whereby genetic information that has been sequenced from the natural world can be made available online. Now, if you've not heard of DSI, digital sequence information, you'll certainly not be alone, but it's described as being a genetic information that has been sequenced from the natural world with the DNA code then made available online for use in research. Well, is that really the case? Is it just for research? Because they go on to say that research can be applied to medicine, agriculture, conservation, and public health, with benefits such as the development of vaccines or adapting plants to be more resilient to climate change. Now, as I said at the start, they have actually made an agreement on this, but should they necessarily have done so? Well, the cultural survival would say absolutely not, with a piece just predating the meeting saying digital sequence information poses risks to Indigenous people's rights and biodiversity. And the point they make is that, in effect, the parameters of this process have not been defined, and therefore, as a consequence, nor has the regulation surrounding it. So, in effect, we're in a position where people don't really even know what they're actually dealing with yet. A message that's reinforced by an article in Nature, again, just before the meeting started, saying, don't rush rules for sharing digital genetic sequence information. In effect, the suggestion is that the situation is anything but certain, but of course this is another instance of the precautionary principle being cast to the wind when it suits the powers that be to do so, and of course nobody seems to really mind what the consequences might be. Also, the other things to fall out of this meeting are that the United Kingdom has now declared 2 new special representatives in this area, one being for nature, Ruth Davis, and she answers to or reports to the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, as well as DEFRA. And then we have Rachel Kite, who is to be the UK's special representative on climate. Now, of course, it's hard to know at this stage what the purpose is of denoting such special representatives. Are they there in order to effectively harness power that wasn't there previously and therefore wield it, or are they being set up in effect for a fall if they're unable to achieve the particular mission they're given, or are they simply being handed too much power? But we'll have a little bit more of a look at Rachel Kite, who was previously Special Representative of the UN Secretary General and the Chief Executive Officer of Sustainable Energy for All. Of course, it's worth making the point that Guterres was the first man, I think, to talk about the era of global boiling. So slightly alarming that she might be in a position to be influencing government policy. But really, let's get to the point and what is it actually about. She is to support ministers to increase senior international diplomatic engagement on climate and clean energy, something that we've seen David Lammy apparently doing in recent weeks. But she is also to strengthen coordination and mobilisation of finance for climate action and to increase the strategic impact of the UK international climate finance programmes and intervention. So, in effect, here we have a couple of new representatives coming out of a conference supposedly on biodiversity. But of course, if you've been watching UK Column over the last few months and years, you'll know that biodiversity is in effect a control mechanism for extorting money out of people with the supposed benefit of an improvement for nature by means that are certainly not within our control, although we are being asked to front up the money, and in due course we may find that our access to the advantages conferred by increasing biodiversity may not actually be granted to us. So there's no real change of direction, but certainly the digital sequence part of it is something that we will continue to look at, and indeed how that may be used or indeed abused in the coming months and years.
Thank you, Charles. We've got to leave it on that note, and we'll be back in a few minutes if you are a UK Column member for some extra. Otherwise, don't forget the interview at 1 p.m. tomorrow. We'll see you on Friday at 1 p.m. as usual for another news programme. Do get involved in dealing with the upcoming data legislation if you possibly can. But we'll see you in a few minutes for extra. See you then. Bye-bye.